All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Thank you for tuning into the stream today. Whether you're watching me live here or watching the recording back on YouTube, I appreciate you joining the stream and watching along here with me. If this is your first time watching our stream, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about DFS, about SaberSim, anything that helps you guys build more effective DFS lineups. So I am here live for a reason. We want questions. We want follow-up questions and clarifying questions from you guys. If you have something to add to the conversation or just a thought on the topic we're talking about, feel free to pop all that stuff into YouTube chat or into the Office Hours channel in our Slack community. If you haven't joined the Slack community by now, first of all, what are you guys doing? I mention it here every single day on the show. There's a link to join our Slack group in the description of every YouTube video, every Office Hours video on our YouTube channel. So join right up. There's awesome conversation going on every day. There are sim alerts to let you guys know when we're updating projections. There are lineup alerts. There's all kinds of awesome stuff in Slack. So definitely recommend joining up there. I host the show Monday through Friday here at 2 p.m. Eastern. And once a week, we've been using this opportunity for what we've been calling a strategy session, where we do a deep dive. I typically bring in a couple other members of the SaberSim team in here. We'll do a deep dive into a specific sport, contest type, topic area, whatever makes sense, whatever's relevant. So we've been hitting the baseball content hard. I showed it up on the stream here yesterday. All of the last strategy sessions are up on our YouTube channel. Been a lot of baseball content recently, the last 4 or 6 weeks or so here. This week, we're going to try to do something I think a little bit different, and we are going to try to pull together all of these different concepts we've been talking about for baseball recently, the 5 winning styles of DFS players, finding the right stacks in baseball DFS, navigating weather. And our goal is to have Max or maybe somebody else here come on and talk about really how this all comes into play for a live build, right? Actually looking at lineups that we're using, we're entering into contests and tying it all together. I'll have more details on that here as the week goes on. That might be something that we do as a recorded video instead of a live stream, but really, getting to the end of July here, we want to take all these concepts we've been talking about here recently and pull it all together in a live build that we're actually using, right? And talking through what we're thinking about and our adjustments and things like that. So really excited about that. Again, I'll have more information as the week goes on. But anyway, we've got a handful of questions to talk through today. Not as big of a queue of questions as I had yesterday, so plenty of time. If you guys have any questions at all throughout the stream, again, feel free to pop them into YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel on Slack. I see a couple have already trickled in here so far, so we will get to everything today. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the app here, and we will get started. So first question today, this came in yesterday afternoon from Laddie here in Slack. And he said, what's the easiest way for me to drop in, for example, my 8th best lineup for a particular contest? Do I really need to uncheck 150 or more lineups so that only one remains and then drop in by rank? Seems like there should be an easier way. There definitely is an easier way, and I kind of think I get what the question's asking here. I'm assuming that for this question, we're just talking about a single lineup, that this 8th best lineup, this hypothetical 8th best lineup is the only one we want to play. I'll go ahead and we'll get this started. First of all, you don't need to build 150 lineups at all if you're just using one. So I'll start there. We typically talk about here with single entry, it can maybe be to your benefit to build 10 so that you get 10 different ones to look at. So we'll go ahead and do that real quick, and we can talk about how to isolate a single lineup to end up using it in our contests, and I'll talk about a couple other features on the entry editor that make this easy. But while this is building, I guess kind of the first point here is I know the question says, do you need to uncheck 150 or more lineups? You don't. I don't even think you probably even need to build all of those unless you want to. So let's go ahead and talk about this here. But okay, so we have 10 lineups here. We built 250, as you guys can see here, right? We'll edit 2 projections so that we can see our lineup. So let's say we're just looking for a single lineup that we want to play in the contest. And for the sake of answering the question, I will assume that it is just the 8th best lineup. So say we've gone through, we've done a little research, we like this lineup and we want to enter it here. We can go ahead and uncheck the ones ahead of it. So yes, I do think, answering this question here, you are going to want to uncheck the lineups ahead of it that you don't want. And we can get to our 8th best lineup being our favorite one. From here, I think at that point, once the top lineup is the one that you want to play, probably the easiest way to just go about this is to just change the number of lineups to 1. And you're going to see it's still the 8th best lineup. We've eliminated the others. This is now just the lineup that we have. We can click save. So now once you click save, it'll kind of treat this as a saved file of lineups. And then if we go ahead, I'll pull in my entries here. And you can actually specifically, I'll pull in my file for tonight. You can actually specifically just identify the exact contest you want to use it in. So you can see I've got this big suite of contests that I'm planning on playing tonight here. We have some options here that I think maybe users are not always aware of. One thing that you can do is identify by contest type. So I can single out my GPPs. Keep in mind that sometimes things are not always perfect here. It looks like it's identifying this as a GPP, even though this is a satellite because it says supersat. So keep an eye out for things like that, but you can identify just the multipliers. So I have some 40x contests or the satellites. From here, if I only wanted to use this contest in just these two, you can just check them in and it will then only fill those contests when you actually use the fill contest with lineup. So from here, I could say fill, I'm going to use the one lineup that I did just now and fill using the ranked fill method, and it will fill it in. And then, of course, I could go on and download there or whatever. So a few options overall there. Again, I would say if you're only building or you're only looking for one lineup, I don't really think you need to build 150. I think building 10 to 20, depending on how many you want, just to see examples of different looking lineups is a good idea. And then you can uncheck the lineups out that you don't want. Lower this number here to the actual total number of lineups you were trying to get out of this build. And then we have some interesting features here on the entry editor itself to either filter by contest type, or you can just manually go in and check which contests you are actually trying to fill here. So I think the most common use case, or like what I think I see most users do, is either building all of their entries and filling unique, or building enough entries that it covers all their contests and filling by rank. But if you do want to get really granular here, identify specific exact lineup builds for each contest, you can do that. You can still make use of the fill button and just check individually which lineups you want included. So Laddie, don't know if you are watching me here live today. I will get you a recording no matter what. But let me know if that helps answer your question, or if I am reading it the right way, or if I misinterpreted what you were kind of trying to do here. But that should be the right approach there. So, okay, cool. I see a question came in here from HBK on YouTube. Josh, I saw your question rolled in first. This one's actually a duplicate from one that came in from Slack. So I will talk about this one first. And he said, what is the best approach and process when creating a single entry lineup? Just run SaberSim 15 minutes before lock, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Here, I'm actually going to go ahead and take your original question here that you posted in Slack, because there's a bit more that I wanted to talk about. We'll pull this one up. So yeah, best approach and process for creating single entry. Just run SaberSim, see what it likes as far as stacks, and then take the stacks and add them to the stack sections and run a 5-3 build that I play and let it give me the optimal out of the team selected. There's a few different ways to approach this here. We get a lot of questions on stream in general about single entry strategy. And one thing I always like to kind of note here overall is that I don't think, in terms of thinking about this from concepts, in terms of stacking and dealing with ownership and searching for upside, it doesn't really need to change dramatically whether you're playing a single entry or a 20 max, right? We have more flexibility with our exposures when we're playing multi-entry. We can take more moderate stands on players where we're maybe coming in half the field or twice the field instead of just fading or playing them. But the overall strategies and approaches that we take to our DFS lineups doesn't really and shouldn't really change when we're playing a single entry versus the 20 max, right? So, I mean, in other words, a lot of the concepts and the things we talk about here on the stream every day are applicable no matter what your contest type is. But I do think there's a little bit of nuance, and we have some time to talk about it here today. So we can talk a little bit about single entry strategy, or maybe how I would approach if I was just playing a single entry contest that night. And it does kind of start here again with the sliders. So I think there's a reason that we have the default sliders where they are. They are data-driven. They're back-tested against real, actual contests by seeing what slider settings historically create the most highest expected value lineups, the highest ROI, the highest return for these lineups. So I think a great place to start is just seeing what the builder is going to give you when you're running default settings. So say we're playing a single entry, maybe it's 500 people. We'll see that we have values for correlation, ownership fade, and smart diversity. I like to go ahead and build 10 or so. I mentioned that before, so that I have a little bit more lineups in my pool just to look at and just to start looking through. Even if you only select one here, we're still going to build you 25. But let's just say we're going to have it build 10, and we'll do that. And we can get familiar with what kind of lineups that the builder is liking for the slate. If you are short on time, so say you've only got 15 minutes or 10 minutes or 5 minutes, like HBK said here. Part of the goal behind these sliders is to reduce a lot of the toil that you'd have to go through with the traditional optimizer, even to just build a single effective lineup. Our goal here is that these lineups that show up here can be competitive, just plugged and play, right? So we'll edit to projections here to get this going. You can obviously add a ton of value here, and we'll talk about that, right? That's what we always talk about here on the strategy sessions and these streams: editing projections, editing exposures, tweaking ownership, moving your sliders around, right? There's a ton of opportunities to add value, but our goal here is that these are competitive lineups out of the box. We have two highly projected pitchers on the slate, probably two of the chalkier pitchers. We've got a nice 5-3 stack, which is what we like to build. We can see our stack types: 5-3, 5-2, 4-4, all strong looking stack types, right? A lot of this is ready to go. I don't think if you are short on time, there's anything wrong with running a build on default settings and plugging it in, especially into single entry contests that are maybe 1,000 or 10,000 people or less, relatively flat payout structures, right? Those contests can be a little bit softer. They're easier to win. They're not as punishing on your bankroll. This sometimes can be kind of good to go. The reason I think that I like to build extra lineups, and we have 250 lineups here, so we could even look at like the pool of the first 100, is to get an idea of different routes to go, right? There's different opportunities. So we can look at our pitchers first here. So it's a pretty wide pitching pool tonight. What the builder is essentially telling us is that Kenta Maeda is probably the best overall play for a contest of this type of pitcher. But your pitcher number 2, you have a lot of different options here. There's a great deal of viable pitchers. There's certain slates where you might load this up, and there's a pitcher that has 100% exposure, a pitcher that has 80% exposure, and then very few other pitchers, right? So we're getting an indication here from the builder early on in our process, assuming that we had more time to do this kind of thing, that there's a lot of different options at pitching tonight. We can look at our team stacks and see a similar story, but maybe a little bit more concentrated comparatively, that Washington stacks are pretty heavily optimal for a contest like this. We've got some Cub stacks, and this is kind of where you can kind of start to apply some of your own research and make some decisions. Maybe you had done some individual research before the slate and you had decided that you kind of liked Toronto tonight. Well, we're seeing that it's perfectly viable, right? In our first 100 single entry lineups that we've got here, we can get access to some Toronto stacks. We can go ahead and look at what the Toronto stacks are looking like, right? Our second best lineup is a Toronto stack. It's a 5 stack, fairly low owned. So I think one thing that you can kind of get out of single entry, where you don't get this impact as much when you're playing multi-entry, and Max talked about this a bit on our strategy session, the 5 strategies of winning DFS players. I always goof up that title, but that's up on our YouTube channel. And one of the strategies that we talked about in that stream is doing a bit more of an eye test of lineups here, right? When you're managing 150 lineups, I think it's a lot more natural to navigate with your exposures. And rather than cherry picking each individual lineup that's going in and out of your pool, I think it's much easier to navigate your lineups by looking at exposures. But when you're just trying to isolate down to a single entry lineup, I think there's a lot of value of just actually going through and looking at what the individual lineups look like, especially maybe if you've already narrowed it down. So for example, let's just say that we were going to do this. So let's say we're building a single entry lineup for the slate tonight, and we're trying to identify the way we want to approach this, and we see that Kenta Maeda is going to be probably the best overall pitcher on the slate. He's got a great value, looks pretty affordable. The optimizer seems to want to give us a lot of him. So let's say we've kind of made a decision that we're going to play Maeda. So we can set a minimum exposure of 100 here, and it's going to then filter out the remaining lineups by other pitchers. And let's go ahead and say that we don't want to play McCullers. His value is a little bit lower. He's up against the Mariners, high strikeout team, but we don't want to play him. He seems a little bit overpriced, so we maybe X out him. Okay, so if we see this message, it's probably because we're playing with a pool that's too large here, given the total number of lineups that we're working with. So I would say in this case, maybe it's a good time to go ahead and just pull this back down to something like 10 for the purposes of looking at this. And we'll get that message to go away. And we can play with a little bit of a smaller pool. And we said that we've done some research that led us to liking Toronto, right? So suddenly we're interested in playing Toronto. And all we're doing here, right? In this case, we're not really setting these exposures to build a pool of lineups that we're going to play. We're setting the exposures to use them more as a tool to identify the single entry lineup we want to play. So again, then maybe we go into team stacks and we've identified that Toronto is a team that we want to be on tonight. Their ownership looks a little low right now for how well they hit. Again, let's bring this down here maybe to 5, right? We're seeing the message again. Okay, so there's not so many lineups in the pool. Interesting. So it doesn't really seem to like that. So I guess now what the indication that we're getting from the builder here is that of our pool of original 250 viable lineups for this contest, it doesn't really think that there's a way to play Kenta Maeda, the Toronto bats together without using McCullers, right? That's what we've kind of gone in here and done. So maybe we can start to backtrack a little bit and say, okay, the number one thing we wanted to do tonight is play Toronto. Oh, it really doesn't want us to do that. Maybe not a good example. Okay, it doesn't really want to use Toronto stacks that aggressively. So maybe we just won't. But I think maybe the point is still hopefully getting across here. It seems like my exposures are kind of changing on me here a little bit. Okay, now we should be back to normal. So let's go ahead and maybe just backtrack a little bit. Let's say we're going to play Maeda, as we said, and we're not going to play McCullers. And let's just stop there, right? And bring this back down to 10. Okay, so now we have 10 lineups to look at. We've identified that we already want to play Maeda. We don't want to play McCullers. And we can go ahead and start maybe using our eye test here. Here's a Toronto stack, right? Maybe this is a good fit. It's a Maeda lineup. It's using a Toronto stack. It doesn't have McCullers. Again, these are just examples. I'm not saying this is the right way or these are the right things to do, but this is like an example of having done a little bit of research. You have a little bit of additional time. You kind of use SaberSim as an advisor, as we always like to say, of show me the 250 best lineups that I can use for this. And now I can go ahead and kind of identify, maybe this is a lineup I want to use. Or maybe it's this one. Maybe we go with a 3 stack of Toronto instead. Right? And then the same strategy I mentioned before. We can remove the lineups that we don't want, limit it back down to 1, and we've identified our single entry lineup where we had some ideas of how we wanted to tackle the slate. We used exposures as kind of a tool to narrow that down. And then we found a lineup we wanted to play. So I like looking back at this question here. I think the other approach that's kind of described here, see what it likes as far as stacks, and then take the stacks, add them into the stack section and run a 5-3 build that I play and let it give me the optimal out of the team selected. I think that's fine too. That's going to be a little bit more of a brute force approach, but there's nothing wrong with that either. For example, if you've kind of identified here that you wanted to play Toronto and you wanted to use a 5 stack, I think you could go in here and then say, okay, now show me, this is going to take a minute to do this, but let's go ahead and say that we had identified based in our research that we wanted to play a Toronto 5 stack in our lineup. We wanted it to be a 5-3. So we'll say at least 5 players from the same team, which is Toronto, at least 3 players from some other team. And we'll go back And now let's build maybe like just 5 lineups. And we can go ahead and pick from our favorite one here. Right? And now this is going to build just a small set of lineups that are exactly the way we want. So I think there are different paths to the same solution here. I think the one thing that's useful to remember is that, hang on. It can be very valuable, as we've talked about here recently, of using SaberSim to allow some of this research to take place for you, right? We might do that with a test build where we turn ownership fade off and we turn smart diversity up all the way to identify, is Toronto viable, as an example, or what are some viable teams that maybe have some high upside at lower ownership. But then I think either going through and doing an eye test method here of checking which lineups you want to play for your single entry, using exposures as a tool to narrow some of that down, or setting a more kind of brute force stacking rule of forcing a certain team to show up so you have options, right? Now we have 125 lineups, so we can expand this up a little bit. We know all these lineups are the stack type we want. They're all 5 stacks. We can kind of identify here with our pitchers or our minor stack exactly what we want to end up playing. I think if you are a beginner or you're still getting familiar with SaberSim, I would probably recommend playing within the bounds of the build that you get with the default sliders, right? One thing that can be very useful here, and one way I like to think about this is that, so this is just the build that I ran with default settings. We'll give this a second to pop back up. So I'll reset exposures. Yeah, this is our default settings. One thing that can be kind of nice when doing it this way, where you run a build and you kind of pick a lineup that you like out of the default settings, is I always like to think about this pool of being viable lineups for the contest, right? There's a great deal of different viable lineups at these settings that the builder thinks have win equity in these contests. And you can identify and use the clues that the builder is giving you to kind of narrow down. Once you've set a stack rule, and you're saying, I want 5 Toronto stacks and a minor 3 stack, and I want to lock meta or something like that, you've kind of, you've changed the system that the builder is working with. You've set a requirement, and all the lineups are obviously going to follow those requirements. But in this test build here, you're kind of getting an organic look at what the builder thinks is viable for the slate. So we saw, for example, when we locked in meta and we excluded McCullers and we tried to force Toronto, the builder was struggling to find lineups that necessarily fit those parameters. And that might be an indication or a tool for us to say, okay, maybe I should check my assumptions here. Maybe that's not the best way to tackle this slate. Maybe I go a different direction. Or maybe Toronto's overly leveraged or too expensive or something for this particular slate. And by kind of playing in the bounds of what the default sliders are giving you, you're ultimately kind of picking from a pool of lineups that the builder thinks are all viable. And you can see here, even we've talked about this also before here, that using SaberScore as a metric will kind of show you that in general, there's not a lot that you stand to lose, even going pretty far down this list, right? We might even be on our 33rd favorite lineup. Maybe we like this one a lot. And the SaberScore here has only dropped down to 95.3 from 100, which is the #1 score, which is an indication to us that this lineup is still probably an extremely competitive lineup. It's still a strong lineup to play in the contest. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that because I know there's a lot of questions we get here about single entry and best ways to approach single entry. So I think to summarize, one, from a conceptual standpoint, the overall approaches that we take to our lineups and the strategies we're using to build lineups that are correlated and are well leveraged in terms of ownership and have upside doesn't need to change dramatically based on the entry limit for the contest, right? 2, the default sliders are a really great place to start. They are back-tested. They are data-driven. They're going to build you lineups that we think are competitive for the contest. And then I guess 3, and specific to single entry, is you can take advantage of some of the tools here we have with unchecking lineups in and out of your pool, and also using exposures to dial in exactly what kind of lineups you want to see, while knowing still that you're picking from a pool of lineups that we think are built for that particular contest. I think it's a great place to start if you're playing a single entry contest on any given slate. Just one bullet, I think that's the best way to go. So good question. I would definitely say on the contest selection side, especially if you are playing a high dollar contest, like maybe you are playing $50 a night or something like that. If you are attacking the $50 single entry or something like that, I might urge you to also consider spreading that out a little bit more and dipping your hands into some multi-entry. There's a few reasons why. One is that you are going to spread out your risk. You're going to have more opportunities to be successful. You can be a little bit more nuanced in your approach to the slate overall. And you're not going to have this binary win or lose, cash or not every night, right? You're going to have a little bit of softer swings to your bankroll overall. But also, some of the softest contests in the lobby every night are the lower dollar contests, right? Those $50 entries or something like that, again, as an example. Even the $25 single entry is a contest that the pros and sharks have access to. That contest, I think, on a typical MLB slate for DraftKings is only about 500 entries. There's probably a lot of very sharp players playing in a contest like that. If you took that $50 and instead you could play a lot. You could play all the single entries under $3, a lot of the 3 maxes. You could play the quarter jukebox, the dime time, and maybe get yourself access to 75, 80 different lineups that give you an opportunity to spread out your risk a little bit more, attack softer contests. So that is probably what I would recommend. If you're playing much smaller volume than that, like $1 to $10 or something like that, and getting familiar overall with some of these concepts, playing a single entry in the $5 single entry or something like that, I think that's fine. Talking about this contest selection stuff, I always want to plug this course we have on our site, because if you haven't watched it already, I can't recommend it enough. On SaberSim.com, under resources, strategy, in baseball, course, build a winning MLB DFS process. It starts with bankroll management and contest selection. I mention it here probably every other office hours. This is 22 minutes of Andy walking through the DraftKings lobby and kind of picking out some of the best contests that he thinks are the best for a beginner, or really even up to like a moderate sized bankroll. And he explains some of these concepts of why lower dollar contests are softer, why they are better contests to tackle, why it's better to take a more multi-entry approach to your GPP play than just going single entry. But with all that said, again, I know single entry for a lot of people really resonates strongly with them. SaberSim is still totally set up to deal with that. And I think that's kind of an introduction to maybe how my approach would be to picking a single entry lineup. So HBK here, let me know if that was helpful. If you have any kind of follow-up questions for me, I think I kind of got to everything that you were asking here, but happy to talk a little bit more about that if you need. So cool. Great question though. And definitely one that comes up often. So I know there are a lot of single entry players out there, but I'm going to jump to this next question here. This came in right at the start of the show from Josh here. He said, MLB question for FanDuel, is 4-4 stacking really optimal for a GPP, or would a 4-3 with a one-off be a smarter approach? This is also a great question, and we've been getting a lot of questions like this lately too. So I'm going to switch over to FanDuel here and talk about this here. Let's go ahead and first, let's run a test build here just to get something up so we can start looking at it here. So we're talking about FanDuel. Maybe we're playing a 20 max, 25K entrance or something like that, and just see what we're getting out of this. I think while this is building, I will start this by saying something that I've mentioned a lot here. These rules about what stack sizes are optimal for certain slates come from the fact that traditional optimizers that require users to set very static, very rigid stacking rules, that's their only tool to dealing with correlation, right? There's not any creative or dynamic or slate dependent tool that a traditional optimizer can use to deal with correlation. So you hear things like, you must 4-4 stack on FanDuel, and you must 5-3 stack on DraftKings. Because again, if you were using like a traditional optimizer or something like that, that would be the only way you could really enforce stacking in your lineups. What SaberSim does that's different than what you typically see out there is that we use our simulation data after simulating every game on the slate thousands of times to come up with actual correlation values with how correlated people are to other players in the lineup. This is a strange correlation. I feel like maybe that's not entirely correct, but let's look at Harper or something like that, right? So over our entire base of game simulations here, we can see how correlated, these guys aren't pitching tonight. That's why that correlation is showing up there. But we can actually see how correlated is Bryce Harper to the other people batting in the batting order. And then we use our correlation slider, which again is back-tested, data-driven to see how well certain lineups perform in actual contests that took place, and set this at a certain value to give you the optimal stack sizes that make sense for a specific contest. So you can see here for this 20 max on FanDuel of 10,000 to 50,000, the builder is basically saying that there's a variety of different stack types that make sense for this contest. Maybe there's 4 3s, maybe there's some 4 2s. We have the 4 4s. There's even some contests that are only using 3 size stacks, right? And we're handling this dynamically. So we can handle this on a slate-to-slate basis, and we can handle it on a team-to-team basis, right? There may be a team that, because of pricing or positional restrictions, doesn't lend itself well to being 4-stacked. And if you went to a traditional optimizer and said, only build me 4 stacks, you may lose out on the opportunities to play that team because their salary restrictions or positional requirements lent themselves better to being 3-stacked. Or maybe their upside potential was all baked into the top 3 guys batting in the batting order, right? A team like, I know Max and Danny always talk about the Angels, especially from a couple years ago, where their batting order was like Trout and Upton and Pujols, I think at the time, and they had this like really stacked top of the order where there's like 3 guys that hit really well, and no one else in the order was a very good hitter, right? A team like that, a 4-stack rule isn't going to really allow for some of that nuance. So I think really to answer this question, I don't think you need to think about stacking this way using SaberSim, right? You can still X out certain stack types if you want to play more correlated lineups. I think there is a game theory or a leverage argument to be made here about forcing larger stacks into your builds. The data seems to, in general, indicate that people are still not stacking enough for the win equity that larger stacks have. So even if 4-3 and 4-2-2 and 3-3-2 and all these different stack types are viable for a contest, if people are simply not playing enough 4-4 stacks for how often they typically win contests, I think it can make sense to want to play larger stacks, but you do not have to, right? Because of the way we are handling these correlations dynamically, we can play high upside contests with win equity in these high upside lineups with win equity in their contests in a variety of different stack types that is dynamic and responsive to different slates with unique pricing, different players, different teams that lend themselves to be stacked well one way or the other. Again, I kind of push back in general on the idea that there's a certain stack type that you need to always seek or force. And I like to typically start most of my builds for any given baseball slate, allowing the builder to do what it wants and see what kind of stack types are optimal. I typically mostly play on DraftKings, and I am often finding myself setting a minimum 4 stacking rule on my builds. I don't want to play the 3-3 stacks or the 2-2-2-2 stacks that sometimes pop up. I also typically use a very high smart diversity slider for my builds, which adds a little bit of variance and adds some can sometimes create some smaller stacks because we're using single game simulations for the build. I also think that from a leverage standpoint, people aren't stacking enough. So I think there's a little bit of additional leverage on those lineup constructions. But from there, I let the builder handle my stacks totally dynamically. So if I get a 4 stack with 4 one-offs, I'm playing it because I just want to know that there's a stack in there, and I'm willing to let the builder kind of decide what makes sense the rest of the way there for me. So again, a really strong question. I think on bigger slates, you are probably going to find that it makes a lot more sense to stack a little bit more aggressively, right? We've talked about that here on stream before as well. What stacking does for us is that it allows us to, instead of trying to pick, what is it for FanDuel, eight hitters really. So 8 independent events. Instead of picking 8 independent events, we're picking events that are correlated with each other, where one player's success often leads to another player's success, or it happens side by side, right? That's the advantage of doing this. That's why stacking exists. So on a bigger slate, right, where people are less likely to just identify and randomly get lucky with the perfect optimal, we want to stack a little bit more. We rely on the tool of correlation a little bit more to build our lineups. On a smaller slate, you'll probably see a little bit smaller stacks in general. The correlation slider is going to come down quite a bit on smaller stacks. But anyway, that's the way I would go about thinking about this. In summary here, right? Because we're actually assigning coefficients of correlation to each player based on our simulation data, and using a back-tested weighted value for how correlated our lineups need to be to win certain contests, we don't have to deal with archaic stacking rules that you see on traditional optimizers. And the only reason that the conventional wisdom about stacking rules exists in the DFS industry is because most optimizers can't deal with this problem with nuance. Is Kurt watching me here today? With nuance, and do the things that we can do with SaberSim. So, but great question. We've been talking a lot about stacking and correlation theory and things like that here on the show recently. I think those are always very welcome, always very interesting conversations. I mentioned yesterday here that I created a new playlist on our YouTube channel that is called MLB Office Hours Greatest Hits. It's up on YouTube. It's a few of my favorite questions and conversations that have come up on this show in the past couple months, where I've snipped those videos out and posted them as separate videos. Josh, there are a couple in there that are about correlation, where this question has come up before or maybe asked a little bit differently. If you're interested in a little bit more here, I'd recommend checking those out. And of course, if you have follow-up questions for me or something didn't really make sense about that, happy to talk a little bit more about stacking. So, but really good question. All right, cool. That is all of the questions I have at the moment. 37 minutes in. It always kind of flies right by. First time I look at the clock, it's crazy when we're over halfway through the show here, but got plenty of time. If there are other questions for me here today, does anyone have any other questions for me? We had a pretty busy show yesterday. We used up almost all of the time. I hopefully got to every question in detail there yesterday, but plenty of time to talk here about this today. Any other questions for me? Seems a little quiet here. I think we will go ahead and leave it off there. Nobody needs to sit here and spend their afternoon looking at me just staring at the SaberSim app. So again, we will be back right here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. I host the show every single day. So if you have questions for me that come up as you're building lineups for the slate tonight, something pops into your head, pop it into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and I will get to it first thing in the morning. Of course, you can always email us as well at support@sabersim.com with whatever questions you have. Oh, we did get another question here. 8 Game said, what's different from FC? That is a big question. There is a lot to talk about here. I will kind of give you our elevator pitch here. So what SaberSim does that is different from pretty much every optimizer out there on the market is that we simulate every single game on the slate thousands of times and use that to generate projections and our correlation values to build high upside, well-correlated lineups dynamically. So what I mean by that is that when we actually say Patrick Wisdom's projection is 11.86, what that is coming from is we are simulating the Cubs game thousands of times. We are plotting his real ranges of outcomes. These are the actual percentage of game sims where he scores different values. So we can see his score between 0 and 3 points happens 22% of the time. And so on, right? We get real ranges of outcomes for different players based on our game simulations. We can see exactly how correlated certain players are to other players in the order, right? This is a coefficient of correlation value for what Wisdom's correlation is with other hitters in the Cubs order. And then what we do is we leverage that simulation data to build strong lineups for the contests. So we have a correlation slider. Instead of having to set difficult stacking rules and trying to pick exactly which teams are going to be used for certain stacks and which players are going to be used as one-offs, we use a correlation slider here that takes into account how much to weight those correlation values to build effective stacks. We use an ownership fade slider here that, based on the contest you're selecting, will tell you exactly how much to weight the impact of our ownership projections. And we use smart diversity, which is probably the coolest thing in SaberSim, period. And what smart diversity does is it is a better alternative to randomness that you might see in a traditional optimizer. So a traditional optimizer, you may set a 20% randomness level, and that's going to basically open up a player's projection to 20% on either side of their mean projection. So for someone like Wisdom, 20% randomness would then say that his projection is randomly set somewhere between like 9 and 13 points for each lineup you build. But based on our simulation data and based on anyone that is familiar with baseball DFS, you know that's not really his real ranges of outcomes, right? He has a floor of 0, which happens most often, and a huge ceiling of numbers that get as high as 35, 40 points where he hits 2 home runs, right? So what smart diversity does instead is, the higher this value is we will take small random subsets of our game simulations and use that to determine a player's projection for the lineup, which actually takes into account the real ranges of outcomes of players, the real floors and ceilings of certain players, and use that to create upside and diversity in your lineups. So what ends up happening here is we run these builds, and without setting any complicated rules at all, we get lineups that are correlated, that have the stacks that you would typically like to see in your lineups. You get lineups that naturally have the right leverage over the field in terms of ownership without having to set an ownership sum rule or anything like that. And we get lineups that have upside and are diverse and have exposures to certain players that make sense without having to go in and set minimum and maximum exposures and things like that for all of the different players on the slate. So without really having touched anything, right, we're letting this build run. I'll go ahead and show you here in a second what happens here. So without having set any kind of stacking rules, we're getting on DraftKings for tonight's slate, we're getting 4-3 stacks, 5 3s, 4 4s, 5 2s. We are getting exposures to certain players that, based on our smart diversity slider setting, we think makes sense for the particular contest. We're getting a player pool that is appropriately sized for the number of lineups we're playing and for the contest. And here's where it gets really cool. Instead of just building 20 lineups, when you ask for 20, we build a pool of 500 lineups so that you can interact with your lineup pool dynamically here without building any additional lineups. So maybe you finish this build and the first thing that pops out to you is, wow, this is way much Philly and Washington exposure for me. You can go ahead and say, I only want 50% exposure to some of these guys here post build, and we will automatically sort through the pool of 500 lineups we built to give you our favorite 20 that are matching your exposure limits you set to certain players. So if we only want 50% maximum of any one batter, we can go ahead. That's a pitcher here. Let's go over to the batters tab. We can go ahead and set that live here in the post-build process. And now we don't have any exposure to any batter over 50%. We can do it with the pitchers too. Maybe we want 75% exposure to Kenta Maeda instead. And it's going to go through, pick through the pool of 500 lineups, give us the best 20 based on the exposures we set. So there's a lot that's different from Fantasy Cruncher here. Without setting, I guess, quick summary, because we simulate every single game on the slate, we can build high upside lineups that are correlated, that are well leveraged against the field, because we simulate every single game, and then you can edit your exposures dynamically here on step 3, right? We created a pool here of 20 lineups that are going to have win equity in these contests, and so on. So I see a follow-up question. If the games are simmed thousands of times and then based on those projections, where is the initial data and projections coming from? One thing I will plug here to start is a few weeks ago, we had Matt and Will on this show here, and we did a full hour talking in detail about how our baseball model is made and some of the improvements we've made this season, how kind of the back end works there in terms of game simulations here. But essentially what we are doing is we are actually play-by-play simulating the game based on historical past probabilities of a certain outcome happening, right? So we will literally start the simulation with the leadoff hitter against the starting pitcher and taking into account that hitter's hit rates versus that pitcher's strikeout rates and the ballpark and the weather and the umpire, right? There are dozens of factors that go into this, and we are actually literally play-by-play for all of our sports simulating what outcome is likely to happen in the first play, and then in the second play, and the third. And I guess in baseball, maybe it's easier to think about this in terms of batters, right? And that's the way our kind of simulations are actually working. So there are a lot of other sites out there that are maybe claiming that they are simulating games, but as far as I'm aware, there's no one that's actually out there doing proper play-by-play simulations here of each game, and that is part of what makes it so powerful. So I will say real quick, let me go ahead actually real quick and show you guys this. I had this up on stream yesterday, but I just want to show you, since I've plugged YouTube a couple times, I want to show you exactly where to go. So let me go ahead and pull this up. So this is SaberSim's YouTube, right? I mentioned earlier the greatest hits playlist. This is right at the top. I don't know, Josh, if you're still here, but the video I was referring to is in here somewhere. I think there's something about stacking or basics of correlation in baseball where I talk a little bit more about some of what we were talking about before, but the video I am referring to is under the strategy sessions and how SaberSim's MLB model works. So we had Matt and Will on. Matt obviously built the whole thing. Will's been instrumental in helping us make some awesome improvements to our baseball model this season. This video is an hour long. They go into a lot of detail about how this all works and how the thing is put together. So definitely recommend checking that out if you're interested in more of how these game simulations and how our process works to generating these things. So, but great questions, and thanks for tuning in here today. So awesome. Any other questions for me here? That was a great one. Always happy to kind of talk about what makes us different, what makes us unique. Any other questions for me here about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys are interested in. Awesome. Cool, guys. I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it right there. Again, I mentioned I will be back here again, 2 p.m. Eastern every weekday. If you have any questions for me, email us, support@sabersim.com, or pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we will get to them first thing tomorrow. I will have more info in tomorrow's stream here, talking about the strategy session for this week too. So as I have more information about that, I will keep you guys posted. Looking forward to the slate tonight. Should be a fun one. 15 games, 7 gamers on baseball like we had last night. Just always feel a little too small for me. So really excited for the nice big slate tonight. Should be a lot of fun. Enjoy it, and I will see you guys tomorrow. See ya.